Good evening. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. My name is Todd Myers. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Social Studies of Medicine. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the 45th Annual Osler Lecture. We're delighted that we can hold an in-person lecture after 2 years online, which I think deserves a little round of applause. But the pandemic is not over, and we continue to experience challenges in a changed world. So before we begin tonight, we'd like to just take one moment to give thanks to a faculty member who worked tirelessly to see the Osler Lectureship through some of these challenges. So over the past 5 years, 2 of which were made incredibly demanding by the pandemic, Professor Andrea Tone of the Department of Social Studies of Medicine oversaw and guided the Osler Lectureship, for which we're really grateful. So sorry to ask for more applause, but thank you, Andrea. She's on sabbatical right now, but so. Now, I'd like to turn over the podium to Saman Arfey of the Osler Society, co-president of the Osler Society, who will give our land acknowledgement and also introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Myers. McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. It is our responsibility to thank and acknowledge them, their presence, and the spirit of those who have and continue to embark on this territory that we gather today. Importantly, we would also like to add that the Osler Lecture is an opportunity to reflect on concerns of racism and other forms of harm in medical education and practice. In the historical context, as well as the ways we might seek to change and heal today moving forward. We reaffirm a commitment to equity, inclusion, diversity as central fundamental principles of the Osler events. I'm greatly honored to introduce the 45th Osler lecturer, Professor Michele Goodwin. Dr. Goodwin is a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, with appointments at the School of Law, Program in Public Health, Department of Criminology, Law and Society, the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Center for Psychology and Law. She's the founder and director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at UC Irvine School of Law, with its internationally acclaimed reproductive justice initiative. This semester, she's a visiting professor at Georgetown University School of Law. Professor Goodwin is a leading authority on the regulation of medicine, science, and biotechnology. Her publications include 5 books, over 80 articles, book chapters, and commentaries on topics including civil and criminal regulation of pregnancy and reproduction, reproductive technologies, and human trafficking for organ, sex, and marriage. We are honored to hear from her tonight on the topic, Policing the Womb in the Wake of the American Judiciary. Professor Michele Goodwin.
Thank you very much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And thank you to Professor Meyer for all of your important work in helping to bring this lecture to fruition, and the fact that this is the 45th anniversary of this lecture lands on me in a very important way. It had a legacy that you have kept alive. It has a legacy in which you have brought people of extreme repute for intellectual engagement that includes not only the faculty but also your students. And for that, I am very proud to be here with you all. And also, I recognize how important it is, the land acknowledgement that you shared, and the commitment to elevating matters of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging as not just kind of tropes of the day, but that have real meaning. And perhaps that provides a transition for my talk today. Just before we began, I was reflecting on the life of Dr. Marion Sims, For some of you who are in the audience, and certainly those of you who are watching online, you may recall Dr. Sims as a person who's known as the father or grandfather of gynecology, revered, a person whom in the United States there's statutes in Central Park and across the country as a reflection of how highly respected he was. I read his autobiography about 25 years or so ago, and I was stunned by what I read. And it says so much about who is able to sit in the seats, who's able to be in the room, because for over the century in which he was praised for his work and his intellectual acumen, for the development of the devices that he did, when I read his autobiography, I read it in horror. So we're not talking about others who were framing his words, but Dr. Sims framing his words and the people who read those words. As Dr. Sims recalled having epiphanies, the word that he used, in the middle of the night. And when he would have epiphanies in the middle of the night, he would go to the women that he had chained, locked, enslaved in the back of his house and in the shed and shack in the back. He kept enslaved black women, those that he rented and leased. And when he had his epiphanies, as he described, not as someone else described, but that as he described, he would rouse them in the middle of the night. He would get out his cutting tools, and he would begin cutting into their bodies. He would stitch, open up the stitching, do various forms of experimentation, 1, 2, 3 in the morning. He would deny them anesthesia because, in his view, black women didn't feel pain. And then he would do it all over again. And it wasn't that this was secret at all, because many read his autobiography and praised his work and thought it was so praiseworthy that he should be acknowledged with statute and so forth and revered. So it says a lot, I think, when we offer a space for a more inclusive conversation such that we can think through in dynamic ways that which we should honor, that which we should reflect upon. And my talk today is framed on the topic of my most recent book, Policing the Womb. Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. And today I'm talking about policing the womb and the judiciary, the American judiciary. It is no surprise to anyone in the world that the United States Supreme Court, in its decision Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, has now dismantled Roe v. Wade, overturning it in Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Now, I should say, before I get started, you will not see a slideshow. This is a low-tech talk, so unlike so many that are in our medical schools and schools of public health, I won't be clicking through slides. You'll have to rest your visions on me, or you can think about and imagine the people, the characters that I will talk about. So our Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, has overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and I will talk about that decision because it's important to center it at the intersections of law, medicine, and also democracy. What does Dobbs mean for democracy? What does a right to bodily autonomy and to be able to determine one's own reproductive freedom, what does that mean for democratic principles? But I want to start pre-Dobbs. And I want to start pre-Dobbs because there is a narrative that suggests that Dobbs was something that was inevitable. That the two prominent political parties in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans, that this had been part of a Republican thought process, a legacy that manifested just in the 2021-2022 term. And I want to disabuse us of that trope, that this was what was always going to be, that this was the vision of the Republican Party. So let me start with Roe v. Wade itself. Roe v. Wade, a 7-2 opinion. not close, 1973. 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion in Roe v. Wade, was placed on the court by Richard Nixon, an infamous Republican president who resigned from office prior to the potential of some criminal punishment for the crimes that he was associated with. But it's worth noting that Roe v. Wade was not close, and that 5 of those 7 justices were, in fact, Republican appointed. And even Planned Parenthood v. Casey, nearly 20 years after Roe v. Wade, is a case that is ultimately decided by 2 prominent Republicans on the Supreme Court. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who's the first woman nominated and appointed on the court by Ronald Reagan, and also Justice Kennedy, who led the way for the last quarter of a century. He's retired now from the court, but whose imprint on the court will last forever because of LGBTQ equality. He is the justice who wrote the series of opinions that established marriage equality and that also decriminalized same-sex intimacy. And one final point that I think is worth thinking about, just in terms of the judiciary and also the sort of Republican Party in the backdrop of how we understand the political framework, is that Prescott Bush, who is the father of George H.W. Bush, as the first of the Bush presidents, his father, Prescott Bush, was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. So to the extent that we hear these narratives that this has just been where Republicans always have been, it's not true. It's absolutely not true. And in fact, George H.W. Bush, the first of the 2 Bush presidents, shepherded through the United States Congress very important reproductive freedom legislation. Title 10, which provides reproductive health care to the poorest of Americans, making sure that they can have access to contraception, breast cancer screenings, STD screenings, et cetera, was shepherded through Congress by George H.W. Bush. And when Richard Nixon was involved in that, both told reporters this is just basic public health care. Those narratives and understanding history is critically important, and I want to be disruptive just a little bit more, just in terms of the historical landscape, in terms of the court, and then get into a little bit more nitty-gritty. What we've heard, and what is certainly an understandable framework, is that what the United States Supreme Court has done is to dismantle nearly 50 years of precedent when it overturned Roe v. Wade. But I want to complicate that a little bit more too, because historical analysis is important. We didn't see certainly a high quality of it in the Dobbs decision, so let me offer a little bit more of it now. Pre-Roe v. Wade was a case called Skinner v. Oklahoma, a case from 1942. And if we think that Roe v. Wade was the first decision that the Supreme Court engaged in thinking about reproductive freedom and autonomy, we would be wrong. This is certainly something that the Supreme Court should know. 2 glaring errors actually appear in terms of the historical legacy of how the court recognizes its own historical jurisprudence. Skinner v. Oklahoma is a very interesting case to engage in the discourse about reproductive freedom in our courts, because it was a 9-0 opinion by the United States Supreme Court, where the court used the language of human rights and civil rights to describe how states may not interfere in the reproductive future and freedom of individuals. It was a case that involved a man. It did not involve a woman. But it involved a man who was a petty thief. And in the state of Oklahoma, they had enacted a law that if you were a petty thief, you could be sterilized. It was a matter of preventing people who are petty thieves from being able to reproduce. The idea being is that if you were a petty criminal, you could beget petty criminals. And what was notable about the law is that it made an exception. That is to say, it did not apply to white-collar criminals explicitly. Only if you were people like the person who brought the lawsuit, who was a chicken thief, who stole chickens because he and his family were hungry. And that meant that people such as him would be sterilized. Well, in a 9-0 opinion, the United States Supreme Court said it was a human right to be able to determine your own reproductive future, and that a state couldn't interfere in that. And so in some ways, when we begin this conversation that it's Roe v. Wade that starts the conversation about reproductive freedom, it's actually an inaccuracy. And let's complicate this just a little bit more for that time, and then we'll go way back. So to complicate it just a little bit more is that in the term in which the Supreme Court heard Roe v. Wade, there was another case. And someone whose name I'm sure you will know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was a person who was bringing that case. She's a person who, as you all have known, graduated top of her class, but was unable to get the kind of employment that her fellow classmates did, the men in her class. She went on to work for a university, a law school, Rutgers, and also for the American Civil Liberties Union, where she took on the work of someone whom you've probably not heard of, and that's Pauli Murray. So let me digress for just a little moment to talk about Pauli Murray, and then to talk about a case that was also going to be heard by the Supreme Court in that term. So Pauli Murray is a Black woman who, it actually is quite relevant to talk about Pauli Murray right now, given that our Supreme Court this week has just heard case on affirmative action. So Pauli Murray is a Black woman from North Carolina, grew up in a segregated system of Jim Crow. And to remind you about what Jim Crow was in the United States, although I'm calling this period of time the new Jane Crow, Jim Crow was a time that many see reflected in Rosa Parks. That's the lightest version of Jim Crow. And we kind of romanticize that. Really, right? So there's like Rosa Parks, a well-put-together woman who looks like anybody's grandmother with just a little bit of melanin, with a nice bun in her hair, and everybody's sympathetic because they can understand their grandmother with a nice bun, sitting nicely in a bus, being told you must get up because you're Black. And there's a kind of sympathy that people have around that story. What many people don't know is that she was quite the civil rights activist and had been quite a feminist activist as well, defending the interest of women who had been sexually exploited in the South. She was hoping for and part of a group that was kind of planning for the day in which someone would try to take her seat on the bus so that therefore this litigation could begin, right? The ideal plaintiff. But Jim Crow was more than Rosa Parks. To understand Jim Crow, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in my speech a little bit later, but to understand the fabric and texture of Jim Crow is to understand that in the American South, there were literally thousands of laws banning Black people's actions. It was Dr. Pauli Murray, a person who graduated first in her class decades before Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was denied admission at historically white colleges. In fact, when she was denied admission at the University of North Carolina, which interestingly is one of the litigants in the case before the Supreme Court involving affirmative action, she wrote to President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, who became a lifelong friend of hers. But Pauli Murray is important to so many of our civil rights stories on race and also sex, because she ultimately goes to Howard University Law School. It's the same law school that Thurgood Marshall goes to, because he's denied admission at the University of Maryland. He grew up in Maryland, wanted to go to the state institution there, is denied admission. He ultimately becomes the first Black justice on the United States Supreme Court. Pauli Murray is at Howard, and in her first year is at the top of her class, had been ignored for the most part because she was a woman, even though Howard University is a historically Black law school and university. Still, as a Black woman, she was ignored in her first year of law school. But given that she was at the top of the class, come her second year, her professors began calling on her. And the part that is not reflected yet as robustly as it should in how we think about American jurisprudence on race and sex is the fact that Pauli Murray writes papers as a second-year law student. Those papers go on to form what we understand of American jurisprudence on race and sex. It is her paper that's used by the litigants, the lawyers, in Brown v. Board of Education. They use this brilliance that this young black woman had. They don't tell her until later, but that it's her paper that they've held on to. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she gets to the ACLU, there's a dossier that's already left behind. Who left it behind? But Pauli Murray, this young, noble, incredible black woman who in the 1940s wrote a law review article published at the University of California Law Review, that's Berkeley, on sex inequality in employment. That's 80 years ago, long before Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes to credit Pauli Murray with giving her the dossier that she built upon. All right, so now why do I go back? I think history is just so important that we thread things together. But my point about raising the name of Pauli Murray is that there is a book that Pauli Murray wrote. It was a book on race laws in the United States. Nearly 800 pages, single space, documenting all of the segregationist laws in the United States. If you're a black person, you can't go to this park, that park, or any other park. If you're a black person, you can't play checkers in the park. If you're a black person, you may not play billiards in the city. If you're a black person, you may not bowl in the city. 2 or more black people may not stand on the corner without receiving a fine. And the list goes on. And I share that to provide the real texture of what Jim Crow represented, not simply that a woman like Rosa Parks could not sit where she desired on a bus, but that as a system that so deeply provided shackles, chains, and a chokehold on black life long after slavery. All of this, I think, helps to provide texture for the lecture today. So, another case that is being primed by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the term of Roe v. Wade is one that no one has heard of, and is a case that involves a captain in the military. And this is Captain Struck. Now, Captain Struck wants to continue her pregnancy. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is representing her so that she can continue her pregnancy, because guess what? Before Roe v. Wade, if you were a woman in the United States military, you had to have an abortion if you were pregnant. You could not remain pregnant. Captain Struck 9 times appealed. I want to keep my pregnancy. Captain Struck even said, look, I will not be a mother. I will just give birth. I just want to keep the pregnancy, and then I'll give birth, and I will give the child up for adoption, but just let me be pregnant, U.S. military. And 9 times the U.S. military said, no, we cannot allow you to do that. You must have an abortion. The case goes before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has long, prior to this time, been considered one of the kind of liberal circuits. And the Ninth Circuit said, well, this is what the military says. You must have an abortion. This is the case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg hopes is the case that the Supreme Court hears first. And that if so, it reshapes how we think about reproductive freedom. Because you cannot deny someone the ability to have an abortion when you're demanding that they do. But it's Roe v. Wade that's decided first, and the U.S. military backs down, so that the case is one that most people have never heard of. All right, this sets up a little bit of texture for thinking about the Dobbs decision, but I want to take us back deeper into history to provide even more context. And I do so because Dobbs itself is framed as being rooted in history, a type of legal jurisprudence that's being framed as originalism. That's the method that's being alleged to be used by Justice Alito in this case. And it's become a matter of hot debate whether our jurists should be looking to the past. Some say no, because how in the world can you have the jurisprudence of 200 years ago or a record of legislators from 200 years ago dictating what happens today? And that's an understandable argument for many reasons. I mean, originalism is not a tool of the past, it's actually a tool of the present. It's only been within the last couple of decades that, in fact, it's been a tool used at all. The persons who were founders and framers of the United States Constitution were not originalists themselves. If so, they might have stayed in England. But they were people who thought in bold and what some might call revolutionary ways, and thought of a constitution as something that was evolving. But the reason why I want to take us back even deeper into history is to really help situate the argument that's made by Justice Alito in the Dobbs decision, which is that abortion was something that was criminalized from the start, seemingly. He doesn't use that expression, but it is rooted implicitly in the decision. And so I want to point out the inaccuracy of it and also further flesh out the discussion. Why is it selective, even perhaps an opportunistic argument? Well, the truth of it is that abortion was not something that was historically criminalized in the United States. Abortions had been performed by indigenous women. Abortions were performed by the people who came to colonize in the United States, what became the United States. Now, that record is made very clear in Roe v. Wade, but it's worth repeating for you all today. But it is accurate that at a certain point there were laws that were enacted that did criminalize abortion. Why did those laws come into effect? When did they come into effect? Who were they looking to affect? And that further complicates the story. For the most part, and something that many of you know, most of women's reproductive health care for millennia had been performed by women. And if you think about it, there are no guys with stethoscopes and lab coats roaming around the plains of Africa or Asia. It's just right. I mean, it wasn't happening. If we pause and think about it, it wasn't. There's an assumption that women have lacked reason capacity such that they don't even know their own bodies, the bodies of others. Well, that's a modern narrative. That's not historically true at all. In the United States, nearly 100% of reproductive health care had been performed by women. They were the midwives. It's not surprising if you think about it. And about half of them had been Black, they were indigenous, and they were white. It was the advancement of obstetrics and gynecology that disrupted that. The men of medicine who wanted their place in medicine, who felt threatened by women, who were teased by the men of medicine. Their schools of medicine historically had been the schools of anatomy. The anatomists were the ones who were taken seriously, not these men who wanted to work on women's bodies. Essentially, they were doing women's work. And if you read again their words, not mine, Horatio Storer, Joseph DeLee, you see the insecurity just spilling out on the page. The page is the ways in which they describe the midwives. And then there's something else, which is that you see that there is a kind of interest in monopolizing the space. You see a kind of interest in pushing the midwives out. And you begin to see the tools of racism and white supremacy being used by these individuals who seek to do this, in their own words. As Horatio Storer and Joseph DeLee began writing about come the period of time leading to the US Civil War. They begin writing about the importance of white women using their loins and going east, south, north, and west. They turned to the American Medical Association as a platform for pushing their agenda. The American Medical Association that barred women from its membership, that barred Black people from its membership. And the AMA becomes a powerful political platform for urging in the political process that these midwives become licensed and exorbitant fees that these midwives are supposed to pay. And the AMA becomes pivotal in the criminalization of abortion. But this can't be seen in a historical frame. This must be seen for the fight that is going on at the time involving the abolitionists who are gaining steam. And how are the abolitionists gaining steam? The chief argument being used by abolitionists in the United States legislature, also by those who are activists and those in the press, is about the exploitation of Black girls and women, something that Justice Alito does not spend any time on, but if you look at where the founders and framers of our 13th Amendment were, the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, those important amendments to our Constitution, which abolished slavery, created substantive due process and equality, were drafted by the abolitionist. One of the chief abolitionists, Charles Sumner, was nearly beaten to death in our halls of Congress. It's something that most American students don't study, and when they do, they don't know why. It's kind of just framed as there was a fight. And actually, a fight takes two people. This was not a fight where there was anything that was equal. He was nearly beaten to death. He had to leave Congress for 3 years after being caned so severely, so bloodily. But this caning took place 2 days after Charles Sumner gave a robust and pivotal speech about the rape of Black girls and women, about their sexual subordination, about the ways in which American capitalism of the South preyed upon their sexual reproduction, about the ways in which American politicians, including presidents, had been part of these systems. One can find in the records, and I have plumbed the legislative record, diaries, etc. And you can find the writings of Thomas Jefferson saying that it's ridiculous to spend so much attention on Black men on plantations because the real profit is with Black women, because they're constantly turning profit because of reproduction, their forced reproduction. He's not alone. He writes that to his nephew. And it's worth thinking about Thomas Jefferson for just one pause. Thomas Jefferson, who took Sally Hemings to Paris, who was a teenage girl, Black girl, the half-sister of his wife. Let's unpack all of that. Whom he has 6 children by, whom he keeps enslaved in a room that has no windows. Worth noting for a man who loved windows himself. Thomas Jefferson writes about this kind of profiteering that you can make on the backs and the wombs of Black girls and women to his nephew, who also takes up 2 Black girls from Thomas Jefferson's plantation and has at least 6 children by them. This is the system that was what the abolitionists were fighting against. But this was also the system in which those who were proponents of slavery fought to keep. These were the systems that were well known. It wasn't as if this was a secret at all. And I share this because I think it's important as we understand what Dobbs represents to address that history. Now, it's worth noting that it wasn't just the politicians of the day and the abolitionists who recognized this. I'd be remiss if, in fact, I didn't speak to Harriet Jacobs or Sojourner Truth. Harriet Jacobs wrote the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's a powerful memoir. It's a memoir where she first describes how she was bequeathed to a 5-year-old when she was about 11, 12 years old. Bequeathed by a woman that she thought would set her free, but instead gave her away as a gift to her niece at her death. But it's not just that's the story about how Black girls and women were just traded like furniture, but instead the story about how young Black girls, such as Harriet, had to try to escape the predations, the sexual predations that were just so normalized in American slavery. And it's this that she writes about, that she devotes chapters to. And it's this part of the narrative that is so often forgotten. Or the story of Sojourner Truth, and there are just so many of them. So many of them. There are millions of Black women who were enslaved, and this was just the normal backdrop. And I write about this, a backdrop that was so normalized that the New York Times wrote about it. It was written about in England, and so much more. But I think so much can be framed in the speech of Sojourner Truth. At the same time in which Horatio Storer and Joseph D. Lee are saying that abortion should be criminalized and that it's important that white women use their loins and go east, north, south, and west in order to protect the systems of enslavement and chattel slavery, Sojourner Truth is giving a speech before those that she hopes to convince to be part of the abolitionist movement in Ohio. And she says in a speech known as Ain't I a Woman, but one in which most people remember for her referencing chivalry and the fact that Black women were not accorded the kind of chivalry that white women were. And that's true that that's part of her speech, but I think it says so much that that's what history remembers, and not that in the speech she says, and I bore 13 children and saw nearly each one snatched from my arms, and nobody heard my cry but God, ain't I a woman? It's this history that, although Justice Alito claims to be engaged in a historical account, to be plumbing the American account, to give us some sense of history that leads to the decision in Dobbs and the overturn of Roe v. Wade, it is all absent from what he curates in terms of an American historical legacy of reproductive freedom. And so let me turn then to what those Reconstruction amendments ultimately delivered for us, which one won't find in the Dobbs decision. So the first thing is to think about who it is that we consider to be founders and framers. For the most part, this kind of narrative that's been used to dismantle Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey and other protections that advance sex equality, racial equality, et cetera, the argument that's used is that if the framers and founders had not thought of it, then it's something that really should not be applied today, right? But then that raises questions as to who the framers and founders are. The United States Constitution was not limited to the day in which the original framers and founders drafted a constitution. It wasn't. Come 1865, the abolitionists are in full splendor, one could say, in the United States Senate. This is after the Civil War. And they are keen to draft an amendment that abolishes slavery. Now, we can look to that record, and I would argue that they are framers. They helped to frame the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment. And if you look at the record in terms of what they describe, what they debate, it's very clear, very, very clear. In their writings outside of that, it's very clear that reproduction is on their minds. And it's very clear that coercive reproduction is on their mind. And that what they are looking to stop is coercive reproduction, the coercive rapes, but it's not just the rapes alone. It is being forced into reproductive in terms of motherhood and whatnot that is not desired. And the 13th Amendment in its language, it abolishes not only slavery, but it abolishes as well involuntary servitude. It's 1865. And it's followed up 3 years later with our 14th Amendment, which establishes equality under law and due process. And one could argue the reason why they came back for the 14th Amendment is because they understood that the work of the 13th Amendment had not been as successful as they wanted or presumed that it would be. And here, let me just take one more bit of time to just reflect on history, because it ties together and it has another story. So if you invite me back again, we'll tell a little bit more of the other story. But this other story is important just in terms of thinking about the last year's Supreme Court term, and this one too. By the time that the 13th Amendment is ratified, which is abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude, the Confederate states, states like Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, I could go on, begin enacting laws. We could call those laws black codes and others that essentially make a number of crimes, because there's a caveat in the 13th Amendment. These are things that are negotiated. So Charles Sumner and the abolitionists are able to negotiate the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude. And there is a demand that comes from those from the Confederacy. And that demand is, except if you're convicted of a crime. Now, if you think about it, many people could probably wrap their minds around it. Well, it's not so bad of a compromise, except if you've committed a crime. Presuming that these people who've been enslaved for centuries are decent people like we've seen them to be for the last centuries, then they'll be just fine. But that is not what happened. And one part of this legacy that I'd be happy to come back and we could spend time talking about is the legacy of our criminal justice system and how it connects to these questions. Because there were thousands of criminal laws that were created out of nowhere to create convicts. If you think about the fact that in the United States, our coal mines, and you might say, like, coal mines have anything to do with Dobbs? Well, maybe very little, but I think the story together helps to inform a bit. In the United States, our coal mines have had histories of collapsing, where literally dozens, if not hundreds, just die. Well, if you read the record of those coal mines, then you'll know that hundreds of black teenagers who had been convicted of crimes because they dared to stand on corners, walk down streets, etc., in the American South, were convicted and then would be rented, leased, to the coal mining companies. And they'd send them underground, and when 100 died, there'd be another supply of hundreds more to send down into the coal mines. It created a new system of slavery. And that new system of slavery was so pernicious that it also included black children being taken away from their families. Apprenticeship laws, which had been revered for helping people learn how to be carpenters, blacksmiths, and so forth, were repurposed in the American South after slavery's abolition, such that black families could be suggested as being negligent or criminally negligent with regard to their children, and their children taken away from them and put into these apprenticeship programs. But these were not apprenticeship programs of the East, like Vermont and elsewhere, where you learn how to become a carpenter and whatnot. These were apprenticeship programs where those black children were then held for 10, 20, or 30 years to pick cotton, rice, cut the sugar cane. One of the most painful things to read are the letters that black parents wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau after slavery's abolition in the best language that they had, because they had been denied the right to read and to write. And so with the best pen that they possibly had, begging to the Freedmen's Bureau for the return of their children who had been taken away from them and put on these new plantations. And so then we have a 14th Amendment, an attempt to try to address some of that, although it doesn't get at all of it. And so where are we today? Well, in the wake of the Supreme Court's dismantling of Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, there are certain glaring elements that are important for us to think about that the Supreme Court spent very little time on. We're now just 120 days or more away from the Dobbs decision, and some things are not surprising at all. The first is to understand that the Dobbs decision itself is a case where the state of Mississippi brought this case to the Supreme Court. The law had actually not gone into effect when the state of Mississippi passed a law banning abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. There was actually an injunction that had been put on the case by Judge Carlton Reeves. And Judge Carlton Reeves said that the state of Mississippi was gaslighting. Now, I had to look up what gaslighting is because I'm not young and hip. I had to ask my daughter, what does gaslighting mean? And basically, Judge Carlton Reeves was saying that this was sophistry, what Mississippi was up to. Mississippi defended its law, saying that it was for the purpose of helping the women in its state. And Judge Carlton Reeves said, how dare Mississippi bring that argument to the fore? This is the same Mississippi notorious for the Mississippi appendectomy, where Black women and girls were coercively sterilized as young as 10 and 11 years old. This is the same Mississippi that denied women the opportunity to serve on juries. This is the same Mississippi that when Black women wanted to vote, such as Fannie Lou Hamer, snatched off of buses, thrown in jail. The same Mississippi that when Black people wanted to vote, like Fannie Lou Hamer, were subjected to having to guess how many bubbles on a bar of soap, jelly beans in a jar, or recite the state's constitution. That Mississippi that says that its abortion law was about protecting women like that. The same Mississippi where 80% of the cardiac deaths during pregnancy are with Black women. The same Mississippi where if you are a Black woman, you are 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. That Mississippi claimed that Dobbs was for the benefit of women, and Judge Reeves said, how dare you, Mississippi, make that argument. But it was an argument that was more than successful before the United States Supreme Court, because the United States Supreme Court took up not just what Mississippi offered by way of its legislation, but Mississippi, with a newly transformed Supreme Court after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, asked that the court overturn Roe v. Wade altogether. So now not only a law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy with no exceptions for rape or incest, Mississippi said, well, you could grant us that, or you could grant us something even more, and that is the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And it was the latter that the Supreme Court stamped its imprimatur on. So, as I begin to wrap up, let's talk about then what this has represented and also what the Supreme Court neglected. Well, the Supreme Court, as I said earlier, claimed that its decision was rooted in history, but I've provided a different lens in American history that does not comport with what Justice Alito claims. As well, the court claims, building on a legacy of concurrences from Justice Thomas, that abortion in the United States was a form of eugenics, that it was a genocide against Black people. Well, it's worth contending with that too, because it's inaccurate. It is absolutely true that the United States engaged in eugenics, and it's part of a sad history that that isn't acknowledged even more. But it's ironic that the Supreme Court fails to recognize its own jurisprudence on eugenics. 1927, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision that's 8-1, upholds a Virginia law that provides for the compulsory sterilization of individuals who are considered to be unfit. It is a case that involves a girl named Carrie Buck. Carrie, who had been raped at the age of 16, who becomes pregnant and delivers out of wedlock. It is explicitly in the case where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, describes Carrie. He does not describe her as black, and she is not. He describes her as a white girl. He describes her as a feeble-minded white girl, and that was inaccurate, but that was his language. And so when the Supreme Court, in Justice Alito's opinion, uses this rhetoric from Justice Thomas that abortion was about eugenics and eugenics was about the genocide of black people, it's absolutely inaccurate, even according to the Supreme Court's own record, explicitly what comes out of the court. But I think most profound in terms of the absence in the Dobbs decision, what the court skips over, is something that to me says so much about the state of American democracy and the value of women's lives. And that is, in a 2016 decision, Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt, where the Supreme Court struck down 2 Texas laws that infringed on abortion rights, the Supreme Court itself noted the high rates of maternal mortality in the United States. The Supreme Court acknowledged that in the United States, a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. It provides a very robust empirical record because there had been 2 years of a Texas district court collecting data. In the Dobbs decision, despite its length, only 1 paragraph is devoted to maternal mortality, and Justice Alito talks about maternal mortality in the 1970s and not today. And it is this which I find the most appalling in its decision. And what do we have since Dobbs? And I'll close on this. The terrain of harm and horror was predictable. You've likely heard of the case, which these I think are more, they're not episodic, they just simply provide a lens into what it is that we are seeing and will continue to see. A 10-year-old girl escaping Ohio to get to Indiana after being raped at the age of 9 multiple times who's pregnant. A woman in Louisiana gestating a fetus that in the state of Louisiana a pregnancy that she cannot terminate involving a fetus that has no skull. A 16-year-old girl in Florida who seeks a judicial bypass but denied one because a judge says that she's too immature to have an abortion but somehow mature enough to become to become a mother. In Wisconsin, women bleeding literally almost to death until their doctors feel comfortable intervening out of fear of criminal prosecution or possibly losing their licenses to practice. And there's more in this horrific landscape. So much that could have been predicted was in fact predictable in the Dobbs decision. And where do we go from here? Well, Justice Alito, and I'll close on this point, has informed Americans that if they're not dissatisfied with this decision, what they can do is just go vote. It's worth noting, as I said, that in the state of Mississippi, voting has been gerrymandered for a very long time. And even in this Supreme Court term, there are 2 cases that they're hearing that involve significant voter suppression of Black people. And the last point of irony I'd suggest is that it is actually this United States Supreme Court that dismantled just a few years ago key provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I can't help but think about the irony and cynicism of a decision that tells people just go vote when it's a Supreme Court that's been complicit in how states have now gerrymandered the vote, which has created voter suppression, making it very difficult for Black and brown women in these former Confederate states to be able to vote even in these times. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to your Q&A.
So if you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic.
Well, first of all, Professor Goodwin, I want to thank you sincerely on behalf of the entire McGill community for that excellent talk. I think you brought an intersectional lens to a very important issue. Things don't work quite like that here in Canada, but many of the issues that you raised in terms of the treatment of black people in the United States are really mirrored in the way Indigenous people have been treated in Canada. But I wanted to ask a question, something you didn't mention, what's missing from your talk, it seems to me, is the rise of religious minority opinion as the dominant way of looking at questions in, especially the U.S. Supreme Court. You're in Quebec, which is ostensibly the least religious jurisdiction in North America. I'm not really sure that's true, but it claims to be. But the issue of something that has shifted from those Republican courts that you referred to before is the rise of a certain interpretation of Catholicism that has really taken hold in the U.S. Supreme Court and in U.S. politics. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
It's an excellent question, comment, and I thank you very much for it. It's really quite disturbing what we see in terms of the weaponization of an aspect of our First Amendment. So many people understand the U.S. First Amendment as a freedom of speech. It actually contains several freedoms, 5 freedoms. And one of those freedoms involves religious freedom. Well, religious freedom, and I've written about this, in pieces. You know, sometimes I joke with my co-author that we should stop writing. We wrote a piece 5 years ago published in the Harvard Law Review about, the potential for a future pandemic. We wrote another piece in the Northwestern Law Review about compulsory vaccination. Should it be legal? And I've just told my colleague we should just stop because the predictive value is just way too much. But it's a great question, and it's incredibly disturbing in terms of the weaponization of the First Amendment and its religious aspect, such that it is being perceived as trumping other civil liberties and civil rights. And specifically, you asked about a certain brand of Catholicism or interpretation of Catholicism. And the reality is that the United States Supreme Court now, depending upon how you count it, has 5 or 6 Catholics out of 9 justices. So 9 justices on the court. And Justice Thomas is the only question mark. He attends Mass, and some people say he's Catholic, some people say he's not, but he does attend Mass. And so potentially 6 Catholic justices on the Supreme Court who've been quite outspoken about their religious views, including Justice Alito almost immediately after the decision in Dobbs and speech that he gave in Rome, almost immediately after. You know, I think there's a lot to be said about a lack of diversity on the court and a lack of diversity in terms of the education institutions where they've graduated, a lack of diversity including with the employment that they had before becoming jurist on the court. And that lack of diversity with regard to religion and the way in which religious expression is now being used in the court, because one could say, well, let their religion be, but their religion shouldn't influence their decision. There should be a separation from church and state. And I think it's a very legitimate criticism that's taking shape today, where the United States Supreme Court has the lowest approval rating ever since it's been calculated. And Americans are distrustful of the court. And one of the biggest concerns is the religious influence of this court. And it's worth noting that right now there's litigation that's taking place that includes not only Jewish Americans, but those of other Christian faiths, saying that the court's interpretation of religion is not broad enough, that in Jewish faith there is a sense of self-determination that a woman would have, and that conflicts with the outcome in Dobbs. So it is a deep concern. Many Americans share the concern that you have raised. And then the next question is, well, what exactly do we do about it? And so the question of court reform has come about. Some people suggest that there should be term limits. There are no terms on the United States Supreme Court. They serve for life. And there are some that say there should be term limits. And others have said that there should be an expansion of the number of justices on the court. There's much more that I could offer with that decision, about this decision, including that 3 of the justices on the court were appointed during the Trump administration and all made very clear that they respected precedent.
Do you think that this battle over reproductive rights is going to be fought in the ballot box, or will there be further challenges at the Supreme Court?
It's a great question. I think that significantly, so here's what's very interesting. Right now, it's being fought in the ballot box, but not all ballot boxes are equally situated. So the ballot box in Kansas tells a very important story. Now, in Kansas, there was a ballot initiative as to whether it should be interpreted that a right to abortion is in the Constitution. 3 years ago, the Kansas Supreme Court, with only 1 dissent, interpreted that abortion is in the Constitution, although those words are not written out. The justices said that if we believe in an equal society and women being equal in society and abortion being something that medicine, healthcare for women, then abortion's in the Constitution. The challenge was whether that interpretation should stand. Overwhelmingly, voters showed up and said, we support that interpretation that abortion is in the Constitution. Now, what was interesting about that is that clearly that was not just Democratic women or Democratic men. There were Republican women who sided with that. And at the end of the day, I'm sure they're looking across the dinner table at their daughters and thinking about, if my 10-year-old is raped by the guy down the street, should my daughter be forced to become a mother at 10 or 11 years old? And those Republican women said no. But what does that mean in a state like Mississippi, where there's voter suppression, or a state like Georgia? Georgia, which was so influential in the last 2 years, influential in the presidential election, such that Joe Biden got elected, influential in Joe Biden being able to nominate and get onto the court so many women. The majority of the judicial appointments by Joe Biden have been women. But that was done because of that work in Georgia. They sent forward 2 senators, the first Jewish senator ever and the first black person senator ever from that state. Immediately thereafter, the legislature, which happens to be majority male and white males, enacted laws that make it illegal to give anybody even water while they are in line waiting to vote, let alone a sandwich. Now, that would mean very little if, in fact, you could go in and out and vote, and it's really easy. But because of gerrymandering and in Georgia, the closing of hundreds of polling sites, which means then that you have to go to someone else's neighborhood to be able to vote. It means that because hundreds in your neighborhood have been shut down, then you've got to stand in line, and nobody can give you water, and nobody can give you a sandwich. So your point is a really, really good one. And I do think that it's going to be at the ballot box, but not everyone will be like Kansas. In places that are in the American Deep South, it becomes really far more complicated whether people are able to fully exercise their right to vote, or the cost that they pay in order to be able to exercise their vote. I think for right now, this is done before the United States Supreme Court, but I could be wrong. I mean, right now, the end of the day right now before the Supreme Court is that this is a states' rights issue. States may determine what happens here. But let me say, this is a Supreme Court that is not consistent because in that same term, there is a case, Bruin. Bruin case involves a New York law that's over a century old that involves guns. When and how, where you can have your guns. States' rights. States' rights out of the door on that one, where the Supreme Court strikes down the New York law. You have no right, New York, to enact gun control. Mississippi, you have the right to restrict women's ability to determine their own reproductive freedom. Thank you for that question. It's a really good one.
Just 1 second.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's a strange question, but it's kind of a meta question. I mean, so, you've pointed out that there are various historical inaccuracies and inconsistencies in the Supreme Court decision. And I gather your audience is not people who are sympathetic to the Supreme Court decision, to Dobbs. I gather, like, if Alito were here in the audience, I gather you don't think that he would sit here and think, I should have done my research a little bit better. I should have done a little bit more historical. I could have come to. So I guess my question is, so what is, you've provided a very sort of careful, kind of reasoned, historical and legal analysis about all the inconsistencies in Dobbs. And the people that you would want to reach with that, do you think, is there a place for persuasion in the audience that is advancing the kinds of decisions that you're speaking about? Or is it the case that perhaps persuading that audience is no longer a productive venue for trying to address some of the inequality and injustices in a decision like Dobbs?
It's a great question, and I appreciate the question. I want to make sure that I get as many parts of it as possible. So one, let me say, since we are at an academic institution, I do believe that it is important that we intellectually engage. I do think that it's important that we learn from history. I do believe in the benefit of archive. I do believe that it's important that we leave our footprints behind and that those who come after us are able to track that, right? Just as a foundational line. And one aspect of that I think is critically important in terms of just the project of narrative, let's say, is that if today there are people in the audience, let's say, not this audience, but it was an American audience that would identify itself as being Republican, with young people in the audience, with women in the audience. And they had just heard across various news reports that this has just been our Republican fight for the last 50 years. This is what we've been trying to do as Republicans. We never liked Roe in the first place. We always thought that Roe was wrongfully decided, and now we've got victory. To actually hear that that's inaccurate is important, because for people who have a different view, we're like, well, okay, do I have to follow this because I've been told, I'm a Republican, I like these other values, and they're telling me that this is the way that my party always has been. Well, I guess I need to pull that lever in the way that they've instructed me. But if you understand that that is a lie, that is not an accurate story whatsoever, it is a story that's replete with complete wrongness, then it might offer someone a bit of strength and a bit of courage to say, well, no, I actually don't have to vote that way. I don't actually have to think that way. That's actually not our history at all. And so I do think that something like that is important. But then to your point, at the end of the day, are there some who just don't care? And I think that this is the part that is the hardest to reconcile. It's hard to reconcile a January 6th. It's hard to reconcile the advertisements that are taking place right now in the lead up to the 2022 midterms, all of the inaccuracies that are flying about. That's very difficult. Maria Ressa, who was one of the 2 Nobel laureates, journalist, recently said at the annual meeting of the American Society of International Law that one of the most troubling things she finds right now in larger political discourse is the disagreement on fact. There must be some universal norm, hopefully in terms of fact. And one of the most troubling things right now is that power, money, and influence now has a way of cementing how people understand facts, and such that it's so important to have a historical archive to contest against what's being purported as fact and as history. So there I hope that there would be benefit, but I hear you. I agree with you. It is a disturbing time in which I'm sure that Justice Alito, I mean, it would be stunning that Justice Alito and his clerks don't know about Buck v. Bell. So what does it say when the justice chooses to use a kind of rhetoric and frame that's inconsistent with the court's own history? What does it mean when the court says we, are thinking about women, but we can't think about maternal mortality today, where the United States ranks 55th in the world in terms of maternal mortality, closer to countries that publicly still allow the stoning of women than its peer allies? What does that say that the Supreme Court ignores that? What does it say when Justice Alito, in choosing where he lands on history, cites legal scholars like Hale and Blackstone, who wrote about the legitimacy of marital rape and wrote about the legitimacy of men beating their wives as an important form of corrective, and that in 2022, it would be the justices on the Supreme Court citing to that those individuals as providing the robust historical account than even prior justices. And I think the final point that I'll make in that vein that I think was really so concerning about the case is that I have yet to read a Supreme Court decision where there has been such disdain against fellow jurists. When you think about it, the United States Supreme Court upheld fugitive slave laws that kept Black people bounded in slavery, upheld a Virginia law that provided for coercive sterilization, upheld an executive order that forced Japanese Americans into internment camps, upheld separate but equal laws, and the laws, the cases that overturned those cases, never did you see a kind of venom against those justices. In this case, the level of venom that Justice Alito uses to describe prior jurists is something that is so unseemly and absolutely shocking. And it is with that that I think you ground part of your question. If Justice Alito were in the room, would he even care about the facts that I've shared with you all this evening? And I'm not convinced that he would. We have one more question here.
Thank you. So I'd like you to address the comparison between the Prohibition period and what happened afterwards to what's possibly going to happen in the future in many of the states. So, some of the things that I've heard about are flights by private pilots arranged completely anonymously to take women to states, ships off the coast of Texas in international waters, and medicine being provided for medical abortions. And I was wondering if you could address that.
Yes, it's a great question. So what's already taking shape in the United States? A question relates to what's post-Dobbs? What does this look like? And there are a couple of ways in which to think about the post-Dobbs. What are the other areas of privacy that are affected, but then also what are the areas in terms of relief post-Dobbs? Well, right now I'm in DC for the semester, but I live in California and teach at the University of California, Irvine. And already the hospitals, the clinics, the places in which individuals are able to obtain abortions have seen a dramatic increase in individuals coming from out of town. There has been the relief of people who finally get there, often with abortion funds. So let me just say this. In places like Texas, Mississippi, et cetera, if you're wealthy, this will not be a problem. You will be able to leave, afford your hotel, afford a flight, et cetera. But if you happen to be a person who is working class, even middle class, leaving the state, leaving your children behind. Most individuals who seek abortions are people who are already mothers, who understand and believe that they cannot afford to have another child. And so for those individuals, even if they are able to get to California, Colorado, Illinois, New York, there are states that have been enacting, that already had protections for abortion and are enacting even furthermore even more protective protections, right? If that can be a thing, it is, right? Some of it is symbolic in the state of California that already protects abortion rights in its constitution and legislature. There is a proposition that is on the ballot that will very likely win, and it is a ballot that explicitly places the term abortion in the constitution of the state. And so people are coming to California, and they're going to Colorado, and they're going to Illinois. I mean, they are going. There are the sad cases of people who get stuck along the way, whose cars break down. And there are already the stories of those who don't, who can't get there, right? Or who struggle along the way to get to those states. There are people who are coming to Canada. There are individuals that are going to Mexico right now from Texas in order to get reproductive health care. And let me just say this too, that Roe v. Wade was no panacea. That is to say, it wasn't a North Star. Shortly after Roe v. Wade, there was a law, a federal law, the Hyde Amendment, which was a rider on American budget, that denied the use of federal funds for abortion, which already meant that if you were poor, it meant that you had a constitutional right to an abortion, but the reality of that right was more illusory than real in so many instances. And so now there is significant hardship, even though there are states that are crafting better ways. I mean, even in California, the governor and organizations have placed billboards in anti-abortion states saying that, look, in California, you can get your reproductive health care services. There are funds that have been put aside in California so that people coming from out of state can get the services that they desire and need, mostly paid for. But even with that being the case, it is still a struggle. And so it's a very good question that you ask about what comes next. And that's part of, what comes next. And there are the ships, and there are pills that are being sent, and there are people who are mailing pills, in a variety of ways, right? Kind of underground railroads of getting abortion pills to the people that need them. And I guess I'll say this. I've called this period a new Jane Crow. And I've called it that because what we see are playbooks of the past being retrofitted for today. The Supreme Court term of last year that ended with Dobbs began with Texas. Texas enacted a law that banned abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, a time which most people would not know that they would be pregnant, and that provided no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. The Supreme Court allowed the law to stand, but what Texas also did is that part of their law provided for a bounty hunter provision. Any individual in the state could sue somebody and recover lawyers' fees and at least $10,000 against anyone who aids or abets a person in terminating a pregnancy. That means the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, the bus driver, the taxi driver, the mother, the aunt, etc. And in my mind, right away, this struck me as a part of a playbook from the Fugitive Slave Act, where individuals could hunt down and track down people who had made their way to freedom and drag them back to the bowels of slavery. And what we see today in other states are threats against women's travel. There are states that are saying that they're going to ban women's travel or criminalize travel if you go to a state to terminate a pregnancy. There are states that are saying they're going to extradite doctors who are in states like California and Illinois and New York if they perform abortions on people who are coming from Texas and Louisiana, et cetera. Again, these are pulling from playbooks. So on one hand, we've got kind of progressive things taking place to promote reproductive freedom and access. And at the same time, we have states that are propositioning that they'll pass laws such as that. And the final point that I'll make is that Louisiana lawmakers, it's not been passed, but for the last couple terms, there have been Louisiana lawmakers that have been trying to enact laws that provide for the death penalty for individuals who perform abortions and individuals who obtain abortions. So that's where we are. And with that, thank you all so very much. Thank you.